The Miracle of GALUNGGUNG, How a Boeing 747 Survived a Volcanic Eruption. British Airways Flight 009, sometimes referred to by its call sign Speedbird 9, was a scheduled British Airways flight from London Heathrow to Auckland, with stops in Bombay, Kuala Lumpur, Perth, and Melbourne. On June 24, 1982, the route was flown by City of Edinburgh, a Boeing 747-236B registered as GBDXH. The aircraft flew into a cloud of volcanic ash thrown up by the eruption of Mount Galunggung around 110 miles southeast of Jakarta, Indonesia, resulting in the failure of all four engines. Partly because the event occurred at night, obscuring the cloud, the reason for the failure was not immediately apparent to the crew or air traffic control. The aircraft was diverted to Jakarta in the hope that enough engines could be restarted to allow it to land there. It glided out of the ash cloud, and all engines were restarted, although engine number 2 started vibrating and the crew had to shut it down soon after, allowing the aircraft to land safely at Halim Perdanakusuma International Airport in Jakarta. Here's a soft reminder to please leave a like and subscribe to us. It will help us greatly in creating interesting content like this for you, and click the notification bell so you won't miss any future videos when we post new content. Let's continue now. At the time of the incident, the flight crew of BA 009 consisted of 32-year-old Senior First Officer Roger Greaves, 40-year-old Senior Engineer Officer Barry Townley Freeman, and 41-year-old Captain Eric Henry Moody. The flight crew members had boarded the aircraft at Sultan Abdulaziz Shah Airport in Kuala Lumpur and were due to pilot the 747-200 for the Malaysia to Perth leg. As the Boeing 747 headed past Java over the southeastern Indian Ocean at its cruising height, the first sign of trouble came. After he left the cockpit for a stroll, Captain Moody was summoned back to the flight deck. He noticed puffs of smoke billowing from the vents in the floor and detected an acrid smell as he climbed the stairs of the jumbo. St. Elmo's fire, a discharge of static electricity, on the windscreen was the first thing he saw when he opened the door of the cockpit. Shortly after 1340 Universal Time Coordinated, 2040 Jakarta time, above the Indian Ocean, south of Java, the crew first noticed an unusual effect on the windscreen similar to St. Elmo's fire. Despite the weather radar showing clear skies, the crew switched on engine anti-ice and the passenger seat belt signs as a precaution. Back in the 1980s, it was still possible to smoke on planes, so when smoke began to accumulate in the cabin as a result of flying through what turned out to be a volcanic ash cloud, it was initially assumed to merely be from passengers' cigarettes. As the flight progressed, smoke began to accumulate in the passenger cabin of the aircraft. It soon began to grow thicker and had an odor of sulfur. Passengers who had a view of the aircraft's engines through the window noted that they were unusually bright blue, with light shining forward through the fan blades and producing a stroboscopic effect. The crew noticed the front of the engines were glowing as if lit inside when they looked out the side windows of the cockpit. Shortly afterward, at around 2042 local time, the number 4 engine flamed out. The crew immediately shut it down, turned off the fuel supply, and armed the fire extinguishers. Then, less than a minute later, engine 2 also flamed out. These failures were then quickly followed by engines 1 and 3 also flaming out, leaving the jumbo jet flying without power, prompting the flight engineer to exclaim, "I don't believe it, all 4 engines have failed." The impact the dust was having on the aircraft itself was detailed by then Captain Moody's flight engineer. "Engine failure number 4, engine failure number 2, he said. "3's gone. They've all gone." The Boeing 747, powered by 4 Rolls-Royce engines, had become a glider. Needing time to calmly consider his options, Captain Moody used autopilot to put the plane into a gentle descent, and instructed his first officer to issue a mayday call. Many passengers were largely unaware that anything was wrong, while the crew on the flight deck were frantically trying to figure out the cause of this freak failure. Without engine thrust, a 747-200 has a glide ratio of roughly 15:1, meaning it can glide forward 15 kilometers for every kilometer it drops. The flight crew quickly determined that the aircraft was capable of gliding for 23 minutes and covering 91 nautical miles from its flight level of 37,000 feet. At 13:44 Universal Time Coordinated, 2044 Jakarta time, Greaves broadcast a Mayday call to the local air traffic control authority, stating that all 4 engines had failed. However, Jakarta Area Control misunderstood the message, interpreting the call as meaning that only engine number 4 had shut down. After a nearby Garuda Indonesia flight relayed the message to them, air traffic control correctly understood the urgent message. Despite the crew squawking the emergency transponder setting of 7700, air traffic control could not locate the 747 on their radar screens. Owing to the high Indonesian mountains on the south coast of the island of Java, an altitude of at least 11,500 feet was required to cross the coast safely. The crew decided that if the aircraft was unable to maintain altitude by the time they reached 12,000 feet, they would turn back out to sea and attempt to ditch into the Indian Ocean. The crew began engine restart drills, despite being well outside the recommended maximum engine in-flight start envelope altitude of 28,000 feet. The restart attempts failed. Despite the lack of time, Moody made an announcement to the passengers that has been described as a masterpiece of understatement. Captain Eric Moody informed the passengers of the unfolding situation in a characteristically British fashion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damnedest to get it under control. I trust you are not in too much distress. Because the engines are needed to pressurize the cabin, pressure within the cabin fell. So, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, an automatic emergency measure to make up for the lack of air. The flight crew had their masks on in the cockpit, but Senior First Officer Roger Greaves's mask had a problem. The tube that delivers oxygen to the mask had become loose, and he could not reconnect it. To fix the situation, Moody swiftly decided to descend at 1,800 meters per minute to an altitude where there was enough pressure in the outside atmosphere to breathe almost normally. Many passengers, fearing for their lives, wrote notes to relatives. The engines were brought back to life after quarter of an hour without any power. Ash had clogged the engines, which only restarted when enough of the molten ash solidified and broke off. Captain Moody recalls, "We glided from 37,000 feet to 12,000 feet before we got them going again, losing 25,000 feet of altitude before 4 successful engine restarts were achieved." After about 12 minutes of descent, the aircraft emerged from the cloud into VMC at flight level 130 still over the sea. By flight level 125, number 4 engine had been successfully restarted, and after a further 1 minute and 20 seconds, the number 3 was then restarted, followed quickly by the 2 remaining ones, which made it possible to fly level at flight level 120. It was decided that the diversion to Jakarta could be continued, but that greater than the minimum terrain clearance over the coastal mountains would be worthwhile and would also improve VHF communications with ATC. A climb to flight level 150 was therefore requested, approved, and commenced. However, by the time this level was reached after about 3 minutes at climb thrust mainly in the ash cloud, St. Elmo's fire had reappeared. Even though thrust was being reduced, engine number 2 then began to surge violently and was shut down. The crew immediately descended and held 12,000 feet. As Flight 009 approached Jakarta's Halim Perdana Kusuma International Airport, the crew found seeing anything through the windscreen difficult, and made the approach almost entirely on instruments, despite reports of good visibility. Moody described it as a bit like negotiating one's way up a badger's arse. Although the runway lights could be made out through a small strip of the windscreen, the landing lights on the aircraft seemed to be inoperable. A wide right-hand descending turn was then made so as to arrive on the ILS localizer for runway 26, and after initial difficulty locating the runway at range, it was identified and the turn right onto final approach was completed. Having been informed that the ILS glide slope was out of service, the first officer and the flight engineer were ready to assist by calling out the radio altitude and DME distance to go so that an appropriate visual descent could be made. However, as soon as the aircraft was on final approach, it became apparent that almost all the external surface of the two main flight deck windshields had been so abraded by ash that nothing could be seen through them. Only by looking through a narrow vertical strip on the left edge of his windshield was it possible to make out the VASI on the left side of the runway. As touchdown neared, it became obvious that the landing lights, although on, were not illuminating anything, and as the aircraft crossed the runway threshold, the crew reported that the whole of the front windows were filled with a diffuse glare of light, as, in the fortunately calm wind conditions, they waited for the main gear to touch the invisible runway. Thankfully, Moody managed to land the plane safely. After landing, the flight crew found taxiing impossible, due to glare from apron floodlights, which made the already sandblasted windscreen opaque. Furthermore, the aircraft's own lights did not appear to be working. In summary, the crew was initially unaware of what had caused them to lose all power and end up with an opaque windshield. However, subsequent investigations shed light on the incident. Specifically, reports showed that the aircraft flew through a cloud of volcanic ash from the eruption of Mount GALUNGGUNG on the island of Java. The aircraft's weather radar was set up to detect moisture, but because the ash cloud was dry, this particular phenomenon did not show up. Because of the abrasive nature of the ash, it effectively sandblasted the windshield and landing lights while also clogging the engines. As the ash was ingested into the engines, it melted and stuck to the inside of the power plant. When the crew shut the engines down, they cooled off, solidifying the ash to the extent that as the aircraft descended, it started to break off and flow through the engines. With air now flowing smoothly through the engines once more, the crew was able to make use of a generator and onboard batteries to restart the engines, preventing what could have been a horrific accident. For their bravery, the crew of Flight BA-009 received various awards, including the Queen's Commendation for Valuable Service in the Air. The aircraft's engine-less flight was also recorded in the Guinness Book of Records as the longest glide in a non-purpose-built plane. Since BA-009's encounter with the ash cloud, the world is more aware of how damaging a volcanic eruption can be to aviation. It took 2 days for the investigators to confirm that volcanic ash had been responsible for the near disaster. The plane had flown into a cloud of dust spewed out by an eruption of Mount GALUNGGUNG, 110 miles southeast of Jakarta. A close examination of the plane revealed the damage a plume of these tiny particles can do to an engine. The tips of the turbine blades had been ground away. The findings were eventually incorporated into a report on the dangers of volcanic ash to aircraft. The only investigation into the event was the one carried out by British Airways, assisted by Rolls-Royce and the Indonesian ANSP, but the full report of it was never widely circulated even internally, and neither were safety actions derived from this work disclosed publicly. However, the fact that this event was both the first serious one of its kind and was well documented helped to raise the safety issue involved, so that when a similar event occurred over Alaska in 1989, the subject was taken even more seriously, and both the direct safety and resultant maintenance consequences of flying through volcanic ash have since been given much more attention. In the absence of a fatal accident, the absence of an Annex 13 investigation was not uncommon in the early 1980s. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.